The Story of a Voice by Shelley Bourdon. At this time, I like to think of my soul as that eternal piece of the whole that is my own. I could be wrong. This world might be nothing more than the dream of a larger mind, a computer simulated program, or a random mix of star gases. If so, then my soul would be non-existent. But if my soul is indeed real, I dedicate this story to you, my soul. Do with it as you will. Introduction. What follows is my story of the soundless inner voice that has guided me for most of my life. I have given it many names over the years. I have even imagined many different forms and faces for the source of this voice. Whatever this source is, God, my soul, a spirit friend, or, heaven help me, some mild form of psychosis, I have for the most part loved it and trusted it and tried my best to follow its inner leadings. The inner voice prompted me to begin writing this story 10 years ago. Every step of the way has been excruciatingly difficult. So much, in fact, that over and over again, I tried to walk away from this project. But no matter how hard I tried to release it, the story would not release me. Consequently, over the years, I have done a heck of a lot of writing, not because I wish to be a writer, but because I can't seem to stop writing. Since this is not the first book I've been inwardly prompted to write, I know from experience that when a book is completed, it must always be released in some physical fashion. In the past, I simply self-published my books and then gave them away to family members and friends. This time, however, I have chosen what is for me a far easier form of release. I have decided to record my story and upload it onto YouTube. Not only will this be less trouble for me, an audio recording means no trees will be sacrificed, and I do love trees. I hope beyond all hope that this is the last story I will ever have to write. I like to imagine that in the far distant future, we humans will be telepathically linked to each other. We will no longer have to tell each other our stories because we will already know and therefore love each other. We'll be working for the good of the earth by then, and no one will ever have to waste his or her time struggling year after year after year to write a story such as this, because all our stories will already exist within the hearts of each and every one of us. Part 1. I don't remember my Sunday school teacher's name that year, but I do remember her dark hair had been teased into an aura of 1960s poofiness, the sort of stiffly shellacked creations that adorned the head of every woman I knew back then. I also remember the sunny bank of metal-framed windows behind her, and that I was looking forward to snack time, to the red fruit juice, and the circular sugar cookies with the hole in the middle that you could wear as a ring on the tip of your finger. There were about 8 of us children, all between the ages of 6 and 7, sitting in a half-circle of small wooden chairs that fanned out from where our Sunday school teacher sat. Her voice was a pleasing background hum as I kept my eyes mostly directed to the floor, to the nearby books of a bottom bookshelf, and to the tips of my black patent leather church shoes which caught the reflection of the overhead ceiling lights. The room became quiet, and I looked up, surprised to meet the eyes of our Sunday school teacher. I assumed she was angry that I hadn't been paying attention, but then she turned to look to the child on my left, and then to the next child, and the next, on down the line of students, sitting in the semicircle of chairs. In stillness, we waited for her to speak. Slowly, as if she were afraid we might not understand, and turning to look at a different child each time she paused, she said, "Jesus expects us to love everyone." At that moment, there was a stirring in my heart, and from the region of my chest cavity came a new voice, as if my mind were now linked to the mind of another. "Yes," spoke this voice, but without any sound at all. That was the first message from the voice. The next arrived later that morning, when all of my family at that time, my younger brother, my toddler sister, my mother, my father, and me, were home from church. My sister was in her crib, standing at the railing, watching my brother play with his cars on the rug of the room they shared. My father, stripped of his suit jacket and tie, was on the bed of my parents' room, sections of the Sunday paper spread all around him. My mother, positioned in front of her open closet, had just removed her shoes and was reaching back to unzip her dress. "Mama," I said, "if we're supposed to love everyone, how do we love mean people?" She considered my question as she bent over to step out of her dress. Standing now in her cream-colored slip, she slid her dress along a hanger and turned to look at me and said, "You're only supposed to love your family and be nice to everyone else." Then she zipped her dress onto its hanger and turned back to her closet. I probably would have believed her except for the second stirring in my heart that day. "She is wrong," came the soundless voice from within. And so I concluded that I was indeed supposed to learn how to love everyone eventually. But how? I knew I loved my family members, but until I learned how to love everyone else, I decided I would try to take my mother's advice. I would be as nice as possible to everyone outside my family, including mean people. For a period of about a year after that, I seemed to have an invisible companion with me every day. I would talk to it, and it would talk back to me through that sensation of a soundless voice in my heart. I loved talking to this invisible companion so much that sometimes after school, I would ask my best friend, who lived next door, to walk on home ahead of me so that I could be alone and silently talk to this voice. I find it odd that I don't remember our conversations, but I do remember that they left me feeling peaceful, as if nothing else mattered in the world except my relationship with my invisible companion. I never asked my companion what its name was, but over time I began to think of this voice as God's, and my heart as the location for my God radio. To turn this radio on, I would place my hand on top of my chest, speak to God, and wait for God to respond. One day, I tried to share with my father a response I had received after I'd asked God a question. My father, who was sitting at his desk in the corner of the den, turned to me and said, "Only crazy people hear the voice of God. That's your imagination you heard. Do you understand?" All of a sudden, I felt ashamed. "Yes, Daddy." My father was a doctor. He worked at a hospital in nearby Philadelphia, across the Delaware River from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where we lived. There in our den, my father shared with me a description of a crazy person he had once seen on the ward as a medical student. I understood that being crazy was a bad thing, and he did not want his eldest daughter to be crazy. I also understood that he did not consider the voice in my heart to be real. But I couldn't give up the voice in my heart. I loved it too much. That was the day I decided to keep my God radio a secret. But my father's admonition stayed with me like a tiny burr in my brain. Am I crazy? I would sometimes find myself wondering. I had other reasons to worry that I might be crazy. Occasionally, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see things that weren't supposed to be there. My father had told me I was only dreaming, but I wondered, why was I the only one having such dreams? My nighttime visions began when I was 3, when my father was still in medical school. It was shortly after the time my brother Slade, 2.5 years younger than I, was born. Awakened one night by the sound of my parents talking in the nearby bathroom, I opened my eyes, and there in the middle of my room, hovering 3 feet off the floor, was a hand, but it was unattached to any arm. In complete shock, I stared. The fingers were curled and playfully crawling towards me, like a hand spider floating in the air. Though my room was dark, the hand was lit with the vividness of 3-dimensional color. And then I recognized the hand. It looked like my father's hand when he played that game on the floor of our living room. Making squealing noises like a pig, he would crawl his hand towards me as if it were a spider, closer and closer, and then he would tickle me and I would scream and laugh. But this wasn't my father's hand. I could hear my father talking in the bathroom. Whoever this hand belonged to, I did not want it touching me. "Daddy!" I screamed. My father was the first one through the door, and as soon as he turned on the light, the hand disappeared. "It was only a dream," he said, as he sat and held me on my bed. "But I wasn't asleep. I opened my eyes. I saw the hand." "You were only half awake," he said. "Your eyes might have been opened, but you were still dreaming." My next dreaming with open eyes episode occurred a year later while my father, enlisted in the Navy by this time, was stationed at a military hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia. That night, I awoke to find a tall man in my room. I had heard his deep voice calling my name over and over again, "Shelley! Shelley!" When I opened my eyes, there he was beside my bed, a man glowing with white light, his head so high it touched the ceiling. I screamed, and once again my father came to my rescue. As soon as he hit the light switch, the tall man disappeared. On another night, in that same house, I awoke to find a full-sized male lion sitting beside my bed. He was as still as a statue, lit in vibrant but realistic color, his mouth wide open as if in the middle of a mighty roar. My father was at the hospital that night, so it was my mother who came to my rescue when I screamed. After my father was transferred to a military base on the island of Bermuda shortly before my sister Whitney was born, I awoke to find 3 soldiers standing beside my bed. Though they wore separate uniforms, the soldiers stood at attention, staring straight ahead, rifles up against their right shoulders. The soldiers were not in any way a scary apparition, but I still reacted in terror. Although infrequent, my evening dream visions had continued, and each time I would scream until my father rescued me from whatever unreal person or thing happened to be in my bedroom. One night, towards the end of 2nd grade, I was awakened not by a vision, but by voices downstairs in the living room. My father, by this time, had been transferred to the Naval Hospital of Philadelphia. He and my mother had invited one of my father's friends over for dinner, and we children had been sent to bed early that night. Dr. B, like my father, was a Navy doctor, only he was a psychiatrist, whereas my father was an eye surgeon. Somehow I knew, probably because I had once asked, that psychiatrists worked with people whose minds were not normal. I liked Dr. B. I thought he was cute. He had given me a short ride in his two-seater sports car convertible during the year that he and my father had been stationed together in Bermuda. I had decided that when I grew up, I wanted Dr. B to be my husband. That night, I got out of bed to get a drink of water. The bathroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway, right at the top of the stairs that led to the living room below. My parents didn't hear me, but I heard my father. He was talking to Dr. B, and the tone of his voice was serious. "She wakes us up with these blood-curdling screams. We're beginning to wonder if there's something wrong. What do you think?" I did not want to hear Dr. B's response. Quickly, I made my way back down the carpeted hallway to my bedroom. As quietly as I could, I shut my door and got back into bed. Gone were any dreams of ever marrying Dr. B. He would never want me now. As I lay in my bed waiting for sleep to return, I decided that no matter what people or things I saw in the middle of the night, I would never scream again. A few weeks later, I awoke in the middle of the night to find a woman sitting in front of the mirror of my dresser. She was pretty and had short dark hair. Though her back was to me, she was looking directly at me via her reflection in the mirror. She smoothed a tube of red lipstick over her lips. I began to scream, and then I remembered. Instantly, I stuffed the side of my lower right arm into my open mouth, stifling my scream. The pretty woman smiled at me in the mirror, as if she were pleased with me. I waited a moment for her to disappear, but when she didn't, I dove beneath the covers and placed my pillow over my head. Then I repeated over and over again, "She's not real. She's not real. She's not real," until at last I fell back to sleep. Looking back, I'm surprised I never called upon my invisible companion during these nighttime visions. Although by this time I still talked to God on my God radio, our conversations usually took place when I was outdoors, often when I was in our backyard swinging on one of the plastic seats of our metal swing set. I think I associated God with the happy light of sunshine. The nighttime was where the scary things lurked, so I suspect that perhaps I didn't think God could be found in the dark. One night, I awoke feeling thirsty, so I got out of bed to get a drink of water from the bathroom. But in the middle of the hallway, I stopped. Blocking my way to the bathroom was a striped red and white pole, 8 inches in diameter, swirling round and round like a gigantic barbershop pole, except that it was horizontal, about 2 feet off the floor. Motionless young children with smiles on their faces, looking more like colorful illustrations from a picture book, sat atop the pole as it moved across the hallway from right to left, out one wall and through the other. This time, I didn't have to put the side of my arm in my mouth. I was able to stop the scream that began to rise in my throat purely by my own willpower. But there was no way I was going to walk through that colorful pole with the children on top. I waited for the pole and the children to disappear. Surely none of this was real. I had to be dreaming. But even though I felt like I was fully awake, the vision continued. I flew back to my bed and once again buried myself beneath the covers in my pillow, repeating as a mantra, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real," until I was asleep. The nighttime visions seemed to end after that, and I was happy and proud. I had stopped awakening my parents with my screams. My father wouldn't have to take me to see Dr. B. I knew I had been brave as the soldiers who served in the military with my father. One day, feeling a bit full of myself, I was fighting with my brother Slade, attempting to wrestle him to the floor. Since I knew that I already loved my brother, I didn't have to worry about being nice to him. He had done something to make me angry. We were at the top of the stairs in the hallway. I was 7, he was 5. We were not allowed to hit each other, but we were allowed to wrestle. We'd been taught how to wrestle by my father. But since I was older and Slade was skinny and also small for his age, I always won our wrestling matches. I would pin him to the floor, and sitting on top of his stomach, my hands on his skinny wrist, I would hold him down and wait until he cried. This was the position we were in when something caught my eye, and I looked up from my brother. At the bottom of the stairs was a small man, no more than 4 feet tall, and he was dressed completely in green. Green pants, green shirt, green pointy hat with a wide green brim. In his hands was an old-fashioned musket, and it was pointed directly at me. I could see he was angry, and I was afraid. Was he going to shoot me? I waited for him to say something. Surely I wasn't dreaming. It was the middle of the day, a Saturday afternoon. Quickly, I jumped off my brother's stomach and raced into my parents' bedroom, yelling, "Daddy, Daddy, there's a man in the house." My father jumped off his bed where he'd been napping, and he raced down the stairs. "What did he look like?" he yelled. That was when I realized the small man in green was no longer there. Sheepishly, I began to describe to my father what the man had looked like. But even to my ears, I could hear how silly my description sounded. No one in real life looked like that little gnome of a man I had just seen. On the verge of tears, I looked down to the floor and said, "I guess I was seeing things again." I waited for him to tell me that I was crazy, but instead my father lowered himself to his knee and pointed to a stack of boxes at the base of the stairs. "See those boxes?" he said. "I don't know why this is, but sometimes our minds will see a thing and turn it into something else, like when you see a shadow in your room and you think it's a person. Your mind saw that stack of boxes and turned it into a little man." He was trying to soothe me, but it didn't work. There was something wrong with me. Why was I so different? Normal people didn't see little green men at the base of their stairs. My father's box explanation did not make sense. Why would my brain have turned a stack of white boxes into a little man dressed in green pointing a musket at me? I remembered what my father had said about crazy people. Normal people did not receive messages from God. That meant that probably no one else had a God radio inside his or her heart. Also, I had noticed that people in church or Sunday school would sometimes look up or point towards the sky whenever they made a reference to God. That meant God lived somewhere high above the earth, not inside my heart. That afternoon, I decided I would never turn on my God radio ever again. I wanted to be normal. So I would do what normal people did. And if normal people looked to the sky to pray, so would I. And maybe if everything I did was what normal people did, I would stop seeing things that weren't supposed to be there. More than anything, I wanted to be normal. And I was normal until the following July. It was the summer of 1969, and though I had only recently turned 8, my parents had allowed me to stay up late watching television for the first time ever in order to see Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take their first steps on the moon. I became fascinated by the moon after that and would look for the moon each night from the end of my bed near the open screened window of our hut upstairs. We were living in a fully furnished rental house that summer in Waterville, Maine, where my father, at the Navy's expense, was enrolled in a supplemental ophthalmology course at nearby Colby College. The house, shielded in the backyard by a tall hedge of thick shrubs, had its own outdoor swing set and sandbox, both of which were shaded in the morning by our tree fort, a billowing weeping willow whose branches my brother Slade and I climbed once the sun made the swings and sand too hot for play. Beneath the willow and all along the base of the hedge was a layer of white rocks. We'd never had a backyard with rocks. We liked their dark speckles. One morning, I was playing in the sandbox with Slade and a new friend of his, a little boy from down the street, when I heard the plink of a tiny piece of broken glass landing on the nearby rocks. Along came another plink, and then the next piece of broken glass landed in our sandbox. "Oh my God," I said, "they're trying to kill us." I was referring to the two mean boys who lived on the other side of the hedge. The branches of the shrubbery were too thick for us to actually see them, but every day they would sling loud insults at us, most of which we didn't understand. Always, in the heat of the moment, I would forget about my earlier intentions to be nice to everyone outside of the family, and would return their verbal volley with my own limited repertoire of insults. "You're stupid. You're mean. You smell like doo-doo." But this time, without any warning, they had launched broken glass missiles over the top of the hedge. This was war. "Grab some rocks," I yelled. "We've got to kill them before they kill us." Never once did it occur to me to go inside to report what was happening to my mother. Quickly, as small bits of broken glass continued to fly at us from the other side of the hedge, we collected the speckled rocks from the backyard and began our counterattack. During the battle, one rock in particular caught my attention. It was so large I had to use both my hands to lift it. The perfect weapon. I gave my humongous rock the mightiest launch I could, but it lifted only a few feet into the air. With a disappointment that quickly turned to horror, I watched as my mighty weapon descended in a slow motion arc straight toward the head of my brother's friend, who in that moment had decided to cross in front of me to retrieve another stone. Wham! Instantly, the boy was covered in blood, from the top of his head to his face and neck, all the way down to the front and side of his shirt. He was screaming in a way I had never heard. I knew he would soon be dead, so I took him by the hand and gently led him 2 houses down to his own backyard so that he and his mother could say their final goodbyes. His mother, having heard her son's screams, flew out the back door and raced towards us. For a split second, she looked at me with such fury, I closed my eyes and tensed, waiting for a blow that never came. When I opened my eyes again, she was running around the corner of her house, her bloody son in her arms. Slade and I watched as her car squealed down her drive and out into the street. I knew she was taking her young son to the hospital, but I assumed the boy would be dead before they arrived. I turned to my brother. "He's going to die, and the police will come to arrest me." "Hide," he said. "I won't tell them where you are." So I hid in a cramped and sweltering attic storage space, accessed through a short door in my bedroom, just above and within earshot of the front door of our house. As I sat in the sweaty darkness of this small bit of attic space, I could hear the muffled sounds of my mother's soap operas floating up from a room in the house that had a window air conditioner unit. Slade had agreed to keep watch at the top of the stairs so he could report to me when the police arrived. But I heard the doorbell before he got to me. This is it, I thought. They've come to get me. My heart felt as if it were pounding its way out of my chest. Bam, 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 came a knock at the front door. Just a minute, said my mother. And then a surprise. Not the deep voice of a policeman I'd been expecting, but the high, shrill voice of an angry woman. Do you know what your daughter did to my son? The boy's mother. No, my mother said, her voice rising in the pitch of a question. Your daughter hit my little boy with a rock. He had to be given 12 stitches. The way the high, shrill voice described the incident, I was some kind of a monster child who had deliberately tried to injure her son. He was only 4. Maybe he hadn't understood why we were throwing rocks. Or maybe she had misunderstood him. But for the moment, none of that mattered. I felt a thrill of joy. The boy was not dead. I wouldn't be going to jail. There was no more reason to hide. Until I heard the sound of my mother's voice. Her anger punched into the 2 syllables of my name in such a way that I knew her spanking was going to hurt. I remained hidden, listening as her angry but muffled voice moved from one end of the house to the other, upstairs and down. At one point, she asked my brother where I was, and I was pleased when Slade faithfully responded, I don't know. The temptation to remain hidden was strong, but as the heat of my hiding space grew, so did my thirst and the realization that my punishment would be worse if I didn't turn myself in. I came out of hiding, and my mother met me on the stairs, her mouth opened in stunned surprise. Maybe it was my sweat-stained body, or the flood of genuine tears that commenced to flow from me. Or maybe it was the shocking realization that her eldest child, the one who had been so helpful in looking after her baby sister, was, after all, nothing more than a child. For the first time ever, my mother, the family disciplinarian, did not know what to do with me. It was an accident, I cried. I didn't do it on purpose. Go to your room, she said. Wait there until your father comes home. As my brother sat with me, occasionally bringing me cups of water from the Dixie cup dispenser in the hallway bathroom, I began to wonder what my father would do to me. Would he whip me with his belt, as one boy from school said his father did? My stomach began to ache that afternoon, and it continued to hurt at the supper table. Later that night, when too ashamed to eat, I sat and whimpered as my father lectured me on and on about the consequences of my actions. I'm a doctor, he said, so we'll probably be sued. Everyone thinks doctors have a lot of money. But, as he had explained throughout all of supper and afterwards, because he was a military doctor, we didn't have much money. We may lose everything, he said. And I thought of the little match girl from one of my storybooks, tattered clothes, no furniture, no food, cold and hungry in the middle of winter. When at last I was released and told to go to bed, no parent made sure that I took a bath or brushed my teeth. No one said, "Good night, sweet dreams." They were too upset about the events of that day to follow the usual bedtime routine. My brother and sister had already been bathed by my mother and put to bed by this time. Quietly, I brushed my teeth, and then I slipped a sleeveless cotton nightgown over my sticky, unwashed body. The frightened, strained voices of my parents continued to float up the stairs as I tiptoed to my bed. Although I hadn't killed the boy, as I had initially feared, my family would be poor, and it was all because of me. I didn't think my parents would ever love me again. And then, as deep as my despair was, it grew tenfold when I thought about how angry God must be. I wanted to apologize to him, but I was afraid to turn on my God radio because I might start all over again seeing things that weren't supposed to be there. Instead, I looked out my window towards the sky where God lived. The moon was especially huge and bright that evening. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. "God," I said, staring up towards the moon, "please forgive me." I didn't expect God to respond. I wasn't using my God radio, and I also thought he would be too angry. But there was the soundless voice again inside my heart, responding to me as it had always done. "You must learn to forgive yourself," was the silent message from within. "I can't," I cried. "What I did was too bad." I slumped before the screen of the open window, trying to cry as quietly as possible so that no one would hear. And then suddenly, I was surrounded by what felt like the loving embrace of 1,000 grandmothers. I looked around, expecting to see someone in my room, but there was no one there. God, I decided, was using the rays of the moonlight to hug me. And so I curled my body into a ball at the foot of my bed, each arm wrapped around my legs, in order that every piece of me remain in the light of the moon. When I awoke the next morning, I was still at the foot of my bed. Fortunately, to my great relief, my father was never sued. I had assumed that once we moved away from the rental house in Waterville, Maine, I would finally stop thinking about the little boy whose head I had cracked open. But during my father's 3 remaining years in the Navy, I continued to carry my shame over the trouble I had caused my family. My shame was so heavy it soon began to outweigh my fears of being crazy. Every single night when I went to bed, as soon as I closed my eyes, I found myself remembering all over again the image of the blood on the little boy's head. And every night I would also remember the soundless message I had received from within: "You must learn to forgive yourself." That only added to the burden of my despair because I knew that I would never be able to forgive myself. My shame lessened the frequency of my prayers to God, and it prompted me to try extra hard to stay out of trouble in school and in the neighborhoods where we lived. I improved upon my polite behavior towards others, including my brother Slade. I was also more helpful than ever before to my family after my youngest brother Mark, the 4th and last child of the family, was born when I was in the 3rd grade. I helped to feed my baby brother, to change his diapers, and even to potty train him when he was old enough. Before my youngest brother Mark was born, most of the churches we had attended, no matter where my father had been stationed, were Methodist. But shortly after Mark was born, my father was transferred back to the Navy Hospital in Portsmouth, Virginia. There he remained for the final 2 years of his stint with the Navy, and it was during this time, my 4th grade and 5th grade years of elementary school, that we strayed from the Methodist and began to attend a progressive Presbyterian church. This church is responsible for introducing my parents, and therefore me, to the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar. The musical spurred my imagination. I began to dream of one day becoming a professional singer, which is why, with my parents' permission, I joined the children's choir of the church when I was 10. Oh, how I loved to sing. Unfortunately, whenever I volunteered to audition for a solo, my throat would clench in fear, causing my voice to turn whispery thin, as if I'd been struck with instantaneous laryngitis. I think the choir director, who also served as my piano teacher, was surprised that I continued to audition. But I figured that if I were to become a professional singer one day, I needed the experience of singing solos. I thought for sure that the next time around my throat would behave, but it never did. Finally, I gave up auditioning for the solos. A little girl named Sharon received all the solos in the choir that year. Her voice was strong. I remember my mother saying once, "Even when Sharon doesn't have a solo, I can still hear her voice above all the others." I decided that unlike me, Sharon was a real singer. My voice was simply too weak. My parents' relationship with the Progressive Presbyterians ended once my father finished his years of service with the Navy and set up a private practice in the mountains of western North Carolina. We returned to the Methodist at that time, attending the largest Methodist church in town. For the first time in my life, at the age of 11, I found myself truly enjoying church sermons. George Robinson was the only minister I had ever known who spoke often about the importance of loving our fellow human beings. My heart felt as if it were standing at attention each time I heard one of George's sermons about love. And I did always think of him as George rather than Reverend Robinson. He was a golfing buddy of my father's, and that's how my father referred to him. One Sunday, a friend of the family told my father that she enjoyed watching me from the other side of the church's U-shaped balcony where my family would sit each week. "Shelley's face always has such a look of peace," she told my father. He laughed. "Oh, she's just daydreaming," he said. His comment made me angry, but I didn't say anything. I didn't think he would understand how much I enjoyed listening to George's sermons. I still occasionally prayed to God, always looking up towards the sky, and sometimes I would ask God a question. Each time the answer would come to me inside my heart, even though I had years before stopped turning on my God radio. I figured if it was God who turned on the radio in my heart, that must be okay, because I had quit seeing imaginary people or things. I still did not consider myself to be a good person. I had, after all, cracked open the head of a little boy years before, but that experience had also taught me that no matter how bad I was, God, or what I believed to be God, still loved me. Although I hadn't learned how to love mean people yet, I thought I was doing a pretty good job of being nice to everyone. George's sermons helped. During each one of George's love sermons, I felt injected by a strong current of compassion. On those particular Sunday mornings, as I walked out of church, I felt as if every inch of me were happily proclaiming, "Yes, I am going to love everyone this week, even mean people." It was probably the impact of one of George's sermons that caused my heart to prick with concern the day my friends at school announced it was time for us to save Marcy and Lori. We were sitting at our table in the junior high cafeteria. I was in the 7th grade by this time. It was towards the end of the lunch period. "What do you mean?" I asked. Marcy and Lori were our school's only twins. "They're Jewish," Martha said. From the moment I had first met Martha, I had always loved her long, silky, strawberry blonde hair. She had pale skin and a nose that seemed a bit large for her face, but I found her to be very pretty. "So?" I said. "So," she said, "if you're Jewish, that means you don't accept Jesus." As if any moron would know such a thing. Julie and Judy nodded in agreement. Judy was petite with wavy, shoulder-length, dark blonde hair. I thought she was the prettiest one in our group, but she was shy and hardly ever spoke, so she remained mostly invisible, a shadow hovering in the background of all our conversations. Julie was smart as a whip, the brain of our group. All the teachers were immensely pleased with Julie. She'd never made a test grade lower than an A. Though her tongue could be sharp, her features were soft. Her slightly plump body was topped with a mass of tight curls that framed her beautifully piercing blue eyes. "Martha's right," Julie said. "We need to save Marcy and Laurie as soon as possible." "But they're two of the sweetest girls I know," I said. "God wants us to love each other. Marcy and Laurie are already doing that." "But you don't get into heaven unless you're a Christian," Julie snapped. This was exactly what my Methodist Sunday school teacher, Dr. Todd, had announced the year before when I was in the 6th grade. "If you have any Jewish friends at school," he had told us, "it's your duty to convert them to Christianity, otherwise they'll end up in hell when they die." I had been upset by Dr. Todd's message that day. On the way home from church, my parents had tried to assure me that Dr. Todd didn't know what he was talking about. But how did I know they knew what they were talking about? Up until that time, I had assumed every lesson we were taught in Sunday school was true. But if Dr. Todd was right, as a part of me suspected then, I wanted to know why God was sending Jews to hell. One evening, towards the end of 6th grade, as I lay in my bed looking towards my ceiling, imagining that the words of my prayer would reach far beyond the atmosphere of earth, I silently prayed, "God, why do you send Jewish people to hell?" No response. Feeling frustrated, I tried again, this time putting the palms of my hands together in order to make my prayer truly proper. "God," I silently prayed again, still looking up towards the ceiling of my bedroom, "please explain to me, why do you send Jews to hell?" No response. Now I was beginning to feel angry. Why was God ignoring me? I got out of bed, drew back the curtain of my window, and directed my prayer up towards the stars. "God," I whispered, not wanting to wake my younger sister Whitney, who by this time was sharing a room with me. "Don't you hear me?" That was when I was struck with a bolt of realization, a sudden inner knowing. Somehow in that moment, standing at my bedroom window, I knew for certain that the reason God had not answered my question directly was that I had been insisting he explain something to me that wasn't true. "Oh," I said aloud, and then I whispered, "Thank you." That was the first time I had ever received what I believed to be a wordless message from God. It was also the first time I understood that not everything a Sunday school teacher said was true. That night I concluded that perhaps Dr. Todd, who seemed very old, was getting senile. And yet, here I was in the junior high cafeteria with my friends, girls my own age, who believed the same thing? I knew I couldn't tell these friends of mine I had discussed the matter with God the year before. Talking about the voice in my heart would have been bad enough. But how would I explain the wordless answer I thought I had received from God? I knew they wouldn't believe me. So I tried instead to convince them that what they were planning to do wasn't nice. "God wants us to love each other," I said again. "Telling someone she's going to hell isn't very nice. How would you like it if someone said that to you?" "If I were going to hell," said Martha, "I would want someone to rescue me." Judy and Julie nodded in agreement. They were all members of the same church. "You do believe in Jesus, don't you?" Julie asked, her blue eyes boring into me. "Of course I do. I try every week to love everyone the best I can." "But do you accept Jesus as your Savior?" Martha asked. "If you don't, then you're not a Christian and you're going to go to hell too. That's ridiculous, I said. The good news is that Martha and Julie and Judy forgot all about saving the souls of Marcy and Lori. The bad news is they decided it was my soul that needed to be saved. Thus began the most serious religious argument of my entire life. It was a theological debate that lasted for 4 years. It's hard to argue with girls who see the Bible and the Bible alone as the Word of God. First of all, I hadn't read the Bible. I'd heard a lot of Bible stories in Sunday school class and had read particular stories from a heavily edited children's Bible filled with colorful illustrations. Once, I had even tried to read the black fake leather Bible the Methodist Church in Cherry Hill had given me when I was 8. But I'd gotten hung up on all the boring begats in Genesis. Also, I had not liked the way God was portrayed in the story of Adam and Eve. The way I saw it, Eve had simply been curious. What was wrong with that? We'd been taught in school about inventors who were curious. It didn't make sense why, if God had not wanted Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, the tree had been placed in the middle of the garden. I had once heard my father say that he kept a loaded gun in the house, but that the safety was on and it was hidden, out of reach of any child. The story of the forbidden tree had sounded like a setup to me, a trap, like the witch's house made of candy from the story of Hansel and Gretel. That wasn't very loving. God wasn't an evil witch, not the God I knew. God's invisible presence still felt very real to me, but I couldn't tell Martha and Julie and Judy about my relationship with God. They already thought I was going to hell. I didn't want them to think I was also crazy. Over time, though, I grew weary of our theological debate. I wanted it to end. By now, we were juniors in high school. They thought their views were correct because the Bible tells us so. I thought my views were correct because I believed it was God who had told me so. Of course, a little help from God would have been nice during my years-long religious argument with these girls who, even though they still believed I was going to hell, continued to be my friends. Frequently, at our lunch table in the cafeteria, I would beam a silent prayer up to the heavens. God, what can I say now to show them that they're wrong? But God remained mum on the matter. He wasn't taking sides, which meant I was on my own, and I was determined to win this argument. One day I came up with a brilliant idea, a joke I could play on either Martha, Julie, or Judy, whomever I saw first the next day at school. I was sure this would do the trick. At last, the debate would be over. "Hey, Martha," I said the next morning before the homeroom bell had rung. We were both alone on the stairway, she going up, I going down. "Guess what? Jesus appeared to me last night, and he said you and Julie and Judy are right. If I want to go to heaven, I have to believe in him as my Savior, God's Son who died for me." Martha looked as if she'd just hit the jackpot. "Oh, Shelley," she said, bringing the palms of her hands together. "I'm so happy. I've been praying for this day. Quick, let's go tell Julie and Judy before the bell rings." She turned, but I grabbed her arm. "Martha," I said, "I was only joking. I wanted to show you how easy it is for people to say those words, even when the words mean nothing. What matters is what's in our hearts. God wants us to love each other. That's it. He doesn't care what we think about Jesus, and I doubt Jesus cares either." It was as if I had slapped her. The lower rims of her eyes turned red, and she began to blink back tears. Suddenly, my joke wasn't funny anymore. I had hurt my friend. My shame that morning was nearly as strong as it was the day I had hit the little boy on the head with a rock. I was amazed that Martha continued to be my friend after that. It could have been she considered it to be her Christian duty, but I suspect it was her own natural goodness. Martha, Julie, and Judy were each genuinely kind people who wanted to do the right thing. But they believed the only reason they ever did anything good at all was because they were Christians. And they said the only reason I knew about the concept of goodness was that I had been raised in a Christian church, even if it wasn't as true a Christian church as theirs. Julie especially enjoyed debating me on that matter. She continued to insist that everything good about our American culture was rooted to the Christian church. Without Christianity, she said, no one in this country would understand right and wrong. There would be no justice, no welfare for poor people, no laws to punish those who have sinned against others. The only reason America is good is because of Christianity. That's not true, I said. There were good people in the world doing good things long before Christianity. No, she said. We needed Jesus to show us what love is, to show us what God is. He was God in the form of man. Without Jesus, there would be no goodness in the world because there would be no love. Here we were back yet again on the topic of Jesus. Why did it always have to be about Jesus? In their minds, Jesus was the only one on the planet who had ever known how to love, and all we could do was be thankful that he had died for us. Whereas I looked upon Jesus as a man who had tried to teach his followers that God wants us to love each other. Jesus wasn't God, I said. He was a teacher. That was the moment Martha chimed in. If you'd come visit our church, she said, you'd understand the truth about who Jesus really is. Yes, said Julie. Martha's dad is one of the most intelligent men I know. He's a biblical scholar. He knows how to explain these things better than we. Martha's dad was the pastor of their church. I laughed. I don't want to go to your church. You're afraid to hear the truth, Martha said. No, I'm not. I don't see the point. It would be a waste of time. What I didn't tell them was that my parents would also not be pleased with the idea. Since the year that Martha, Julie, Judy, and I had begun our theological debate in junior high, my parents had left the Methodist Church and joined a Unitarian Universalist church in nearby Asheville, the Atheist Church, as it was known by the students of my high school. Since a lot of my classmates seemed to think atheists were evil, and also because I still considered myself to be a Christian, I had decided it was best not to tell anyone about my parents' defection from the Methodists to the Unitarians. Unlike me, my parents no longer considered themselves to be Christian. In fact, no one in my parents' new church seemed to be a Christian, though most of them, from what I could tell, had been raised in Christian churches. Martha, Julie, and Judy still assumed my family was Methodist. If they had known my parents had left the Methodist Church in order to join the Atheist Church, I wouldn't have had a theological leg left to stand on, or at least that's how I saw it. I just don't want to go, I said. You're afraid, Martha said. I am not. And that was when I realized I had to go. I had to show them I was not afraid of their church, of Martha's preacher dad, or of the truth, as they put it. I was 16 by this time, able to drive myself to their church. That is, if my parents allowed me to go. While it is true that most Unitarian Universalists pride themselves in being religiously tolerant, it was also true that my parents were still hurt over how they had been treated by some of the folks in their Methodist adult Sunday school class. One Sunday, a friend of my father's had said, "You sound like an atheist." I don't think I want my children playing with yours anymore. If I wanted my parents' permission to go to Martha's church, I knew my approach would have to appeal to their intellect. Most of the sermons at my parents' Unitarian church were of a highly intellectual nature: astronomy, evolution, the scientific theories about the origins of the universe, or the teachings found within Buddhism. Maybe if I promoted a visit to Martha's church as a sort of intellectual field trip, my parents would be pleased. My parents were not pleased. "Why do you want to go back to a Christian church?" my mother asked, in a tone I was sure she would have used if I'd just declared I wanted to return to junior high. "And not just a Christian church," my father added, "a fundamentalist church." Perhaps they imagined my returning from this church with moony eyes, singing the praises of Jesus as I also prayed for their souls. Little did they know that Martha and Julie, with a silent Judy at their side, had been preaching to me since the 7th grade. But it wasn't just the idea of a Christian fundamentalist church that had my father worried. "You're the friend of the pastor's daughter," he said. "He may try to change you." "He didn't before," I said. I'd had a Friday night sleepover at Martha's home once, and though Martha's dad had droned on at the supper table when he had blessed our meal, he'd hardly spoken to me other than a friendly hello. He was very quiet during dinner as his wife and daughters happily chatted with me, asking me lots of polite questions. "Besides," I added, "I don't think you know me very well. I'm not that easy to change." How shocked my parents would have been had they known I still considered myself to be a Christian. "I don't think you know these people very well," my father said. "They take everything in the Bible as literally true. You don't know what you're dealing with." "So let me learn," I said. "Think about what an educational experience it will be for me to observe Christian fundamentalists in their own church." That was the line that won them over. The following Sunday, while my family made its usual 35-minute Sunday trek to the Unitarian church in Asheville, I made my way over to enemy territory, to the Presbyterian church where Martha's dad would be preaching from the pulpit the truth Martha and Julie and Judy so desperately wanted me to hear. When I walked into my friend's church, it almost seemed as if some of the adults had been warned ahead of time of my visit. As Martha, Julie, and Judy directed me to a pew 4 rows back front and center, I was introduced to a handful of women with tight, closed-lip smiles that made me feel uneasy. What have I gotten myself into, I thought, as we scooted down the long, cream-colored cushion that stretched the entire length of the pew. The church was simply decorated. Tall, frosted paned windows lined both sides of the sanctuary. A large gold cross graced the front of the church, and there were ferns on either side of the pulpit, which was flanked to the right with a wooden choir stall and the metal pipes of an organ. The morning sun filled the beige-tinted windows to my left, giving the entire sanctuary a warm, happy glow. Maybe their church wouldn't be so bad. And it wasn't bad at all in the beginning. Following a prelude of organ music, there was an opening prayer, a comforting hymn that was actually fun for me to sing, and light-hearted church announcements that caused chuckles to erupt from the pews. I could feel the tension in my body beginning to ease. But then a change came over Martha's father as he stood in front of the pulpit. It was as if his face had become a living barometer, announcing bad weather on the way. The scripture that day was from the Gospel of John. "Jesus said, 'I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me,'" proclaimed the Reverend, whom I'll refer to as Jonathan Edwards, in honor of a well-known colonial American revivalist preacher. Each time the scripture was repeated, the pigment of Reverend Edwards' face darkened, his skin transformed from the soft paleness often found on individuals with red hair to a healthy pink-cheeked rosy glow, and finally to flaming bright red cheeks. His dark eyes, topped by angry knit brows, remained focused on my own during his entire sermon. Reverend Edwards was short and of medium build. Away from the pulpit, for instance, earlier that morning in the church, but also the night I had watched him at his family's dinner table, he had borne a perpetual twinkle to his eye, a slight smile upon his face, as if he were amused by the happenings of his surroundings. But that Sunday morning in the pulpit, he changed into something that was closer akin to the street preachers I had seen sometimes, not in real life, but in movies, on television, and in the theater. Wow, I thought, guys like this really exist. Several times during the sermon of the newly transformed street preacher version of Reverend Edwards, I was given detailed and what at times seemed like first-hand accounts of what the fires of hell would be like for those who did not accept Jesus as the only way to God. As he glared at me, I made sure to glare back. And as I glared at Martha's father, I kept silently repeating the words which I hoped the expression on my face clearly conveyed. You mean man. You mean man. I imagine Reverend Edwards intended his words to overpower me, to persuade me, and to change me. But the change did not come until later. Sometimes when I think back upon this morning, I imagine how different my visit to this church might have been had I known a bit more about the Bible. For instance, there's a passage from the Gospel of Matthew with instructions for Jesus' followers. If they ever receive a poor welcome, they're supposed to shake off the dust from their feet as they leave that house or town. How I wish I had launched my body from the pew that Sunday, raised a fist towards Reverend Edwards, then righteously proclaimed as I walked towards the aisle, I'm shaking the dust of this church from my feet. Instead, I simply muttered a quick goodbye to Martha, Julie, and Judy when the service was over, and then I flew out of the church as fast as I could. By the time I made it back to my car, I had arrived at a very important decision. And it was not what Martha or Julie or Judy or the Reverend Jonathan Edwards had been hoping for. Even if not all Christians were like Martha's father, I knew that I could no longer be associated with a religion that included such unkind people. No longer could I call myself a Christian. And because I still considered God and Christianity to be one and the same, by the time I got home that morning, I had also decided that I no longer wanted to have anything more to do with God. If this is what a belief in God could sometimes turn people into, I wanted nothing more to do with such a concept. From here on, I would be an atheist. And the silent inner voice of my heart, I quickly dismissed it, deciding that my father had been right all along. The voice had been nothing more than a creation of my childish imagination. I was finished with God, I was finished with the church, and I was finished with the silent voice from within. What a wonderfully empowering feeling to reject in an instant every religious concept I had ever believed in as a child. How grown up and free I now felt, like a young bird who's just learned to fly beyond the confines of her nest. I was shaking the dust of an entire religion from my feet. Martha and Julie and Judy were crestfallen to hear, once I returned to school the next day, that I no longer considered myself to be a Christian and was now an atheist. I took great pleasure in thanking them. If it weren't for you, I said, I'd still be a Christian. Thank you for setting me free. I could tell they were hearing something new, a person without the truth who had gone to their church and upon hearing the truth had moved herself even further from the truth. Perhaps they thought I was under the influence of the devil. I didn't care. I certainly didn't believe in the devil, and now I no longer believed in God. The shackles of my former existence had been removed. Atheism, I decided, was great. Amazingly, my friendship with Martha, Julie, and Judy continued, but our debates about Christianity and Jesus came to a sudden end. If I had known it was going to be like this, I would have become an atheist long ago, I remember thinking during lunch one day. Our cafeteria conversations evolved into normal teenage talk about hair, pimples, boys, and clothing. If one of them had asked, Shelley, are you planning to remain an atheist for the rest of your life? I would have answered, of course. Now that I was an atheist, knocked off the foundation of my former childhood self, I moved into previously unexplored extracurricular pursuits such as student government and drama, activities that allowed me to play my newly minted role of rebel. By this time, I had been elected vice president of our high school's student government. One of my duties was finding folks who would give the inspiration of the day before each of our high school assemblies. Now that I was an atheist, I made sure that everyone I chose for this task understood that Christian prayers before assemblies, which had been the norm before I was vice president, were no longer allowed. I also took frequent opportunities in class and out now to make snide comments or to roll my eyes anytime someone made a reference to God or Jesus or to the Bible. When our drama teacher surprised me one day asking me to participate in the production of Godspell, the 1970s hit musical which tells the story of Jesus, I didn't know how to respond at first. I knew I did not like Godspell's religious theme, but after some amount of debate with myself, I finally agreed to be a part of the production. My newly expanded, more extroverted self relished any and all opportunities to be upon a stage. But after I overheard a cast member say that he hoped our production would win people to Jesus, I withdrew from the beginning stages of rehearsal, forcing my infuriated drama teacher to find a replacement for me at the last minute. I didn't care about the trouble I had caused him. I wanted nothing more to do now with anything that was in any way connected to Christianity. Unfortunately for my teachers, that particular display of righteous unruliness emboldened me further. Shortly after angering the drama teacher, Mr. Orr, by dropping out of the production of Godspell, I upset the band director, Mr. Stokes, when, during the middle of my audition for first chair flute, I became so frustrated by the subpar level of my performance that, as if in a dream, I stopped mid-measure in the middle of my piece and, even to my own shock, let loose a quietly whispered curse word. On yet another occasion, during a rehearsal for the Honor Society induction ceremony, when our sponsor, the high school guidance counselor, requested that I redo all of the music I'd put together for the ceremony's slideshow, I looked down from the stage to where he sat in the front row of the auditorium, and I said, Mr. Johnson, no one gives a fart about the background music for the slideshow. I worked hard to put this music together. I'm not changing it. My fellow Honor Society members twittered in amusement. but Mr. Johnson said nothing. The next day, I was called out of class over the school's intercom system and told to report to the office. There, I was ordered by Mr. Johnson to apologize to the school's Spanish teacher for using such ugly language in front of a lady. Supposedly, she had overheard me the day before because she had been sitting in the back of the auditorium. I will not apologize to her because she's a woman, I said. If, however, I offended her, she can tell me so herself, and then I will apologize. I thought for sure I would be expelled from school that day. Mr. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest, and he glared. But after a moment, he raised one arm, flicked his hand in the air, and said, "Get out of here." The power I felt as I walked back to class was immense. I'd always been respected by the nerds of the school, but now as the stories of my mouth began to spread, even the badass students of the school, the ones who always seemed to be smoking cigarettes in the parking lot, were beginning to take notice of me. "Hey!" a guy called to me one morning from the parking lot, smoke hanging as a cloud around his head. "You're the one who said shit in front of Stokes, right?" "Yes," I said. "Cool," he said. I smiled, relishing my new role of bad girl. Not only was I discovering the power of my own voice, I was also now discovering the power of my body via playful makeout sessions with my newly acquired boyfriend. Back in the late 1970s, everyone assumed that if you were steadily dating someone, you were no longer a virgin. I was still a virgin, but I loved that people didn't think so because my bad girl image became stronger, and that made me even bolder. During a state drama competition of one-act plays, of which I was a participant, 2 of us girls had been warned not to wear revealing bras beneath the skin-tight white shirts that were a part of our costume. The other girl, a good student who always did as she was told, wore a thick bra that properly covered her nipples. I, on the other hand, wore the thinnest, most see-through bra I owned. A daring act on my part, made easier by the fact that my face was painted black and white, making me completely unrecognizable. Every eye of every teenaged boy at the drama competition remained glued to my chest during our entire performance. How thrilling it was, feeling the power of my exposed nipples over these boys. Why had I ever wanted to be good when it was so much fun to be bad? My senior year of high school, I continued to play the role of bad girl. Then one day I learned I wasn't quite the bad girl I had imagined myself to be. One of the football players walked up to me outside of school one morning. "You know what the football players have decided?" he asked. "What?" I said. "They think you'd be a good piece of ass if you weren't such an egghead." He laughed. And I did too, but I took his comment as a compliment. It made me feel good to know that the football players considered me to be such an intelligent person. That was the day I decided that there was nothing wrong with being a nerd, as long as I remembered how to have fun, and I did continue to have fun. Sometimes, though, my sense of humor made me erupt in laughter during class, the sort of uncontrollable laughter that landed me a few times in the hallway so that I could, as the teacher would put it, get control of myself. Once during a social studies class, our teacher decided it would be a good idea if we all took turns reading aloud from the Constitution. Student after student continued to mispronounce words they weren't used to reading, and soon it began to sound like a skit from the popular TV show Saturday Night Live. I knew it would be rude to laugh, But each time I had ever attempted to control my laughter, the force of it would surge even stronger within me, until at some point I would erupt in quiet giggles. That day, in the social studies class, my quiet giggles soon transformed into snorts of laughter, which I then tried to disguise as a coughing fit. But before I knew it, I was laughing so hard I had to wipe tears from my eyes. I know this must have been very challenging for my teacher, whose face continued to grow more tense, even as she did her best to ignore me. I'm sure she was on the verge of sending me out into the hallway, but that afternoon I was literally saved by the bell. In one class, though, I never got tickled. That was my senior psychology class. I loved psychology, and it showed. I won the Senior Psychology Award that year. My teacher later told my parents that he had never known a student more suited to the study of psychology. I was fascinated by Carl Jung's concept of the major archetypes, those symbolic images that appear in people's dreams from all over the world, for instance, that of maiden, hero, witch, trickster, wise man, and magician. That helped to prove, in my opinion, the validity of Jung's concept that our minds are connected at a deep, deep level, below that of the personal subconscious mind, which he referred to as the personal unconscious. Jung called this deeper consciousness, where all human minds are connected, the collective unconscious. But as much as Carl Jung's ideas intrigued me, it was actually Abraham Maslow's concept of self-actualization that completely captivated me. What would it be like, I frequently found myself wondering, to fully know myself, all aspects of myself within my conscious and subconscious mind? How I ached to hold such knowledge. One day in class, I silently vowed to myself that before I died, I would become a self-actualized individual. I would learn what it meant to be fully me, whoever or whatever I was. That was also the day I decided I would become a psychologist. What could be more interesting than continuing my study of psychology? And what would be more perfect than working one day as a clinical psychologist, getting to know more fully the minds of others as well as my own? I already knew psychologists must be the coolest people on the planet. The psychologists I had studied in class that year were certainly the most engaging people I'd ever read about. I couldn't wait to join their tribe the following fall when I set off for college. For a long time, I'd had my heart set on Warren Wilson College, a small private school in the mountains east of Asheville. Most of the students who attended Warren Wilson majored in environmental science. They also raised cows and chickens and pigs and had their own large organic garden, which provided food for most of the meals served in the school's cafeteria. Every student was required to work the same amount of hours each week for the college, which meant that in addition to their farm work, they worked in the cafeteria, the library, and in every office on campus. I had visited the school during regional drama competitions that had been held on Warren Wilson's campus, and I had fallen in love with the look and the feel of the college. To me, the students of Warren Wilson seemed more down to earth, more authentically themselves than the students of any other college I had visited. Since I considered myself to be on the path to self-actualization, I thought spending time with such authentically real students would help me to be more real and therefore to increase knowledge of myself. But it was not meant to be. My father had made it clear that he would not subsidize a private college education, even if it was such a place as down-to-earth Warren Wilson College. He wanted me to take advantage of North Carolina's system of state universities, which he considered to be a good deal. Since he was a successful eye surgeon by this time, who, if he'd been willing, could easily have afforded Warren Wilson's tuition, I knew I would be ineligible for a government student loan. So instead, I settled on the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the creme de la creme of North Carolina's state universities, or at least that's what we'd been told at my high school. I figured I would have no problem getting in, and thankfully I didn't. And since a handful of other folks from my high school would also be attending UNC, I was able to pick out a roommate for my upcoming freshman year of college. Kitty and I had not known each other as long as I'd known Martha, Julie, and Judy, but we both believed we'd be the perfect roommates for each other. One day we pitched our money together and purchased a beautiful antique wooden fish aquarium. Neither one of us had ever kept fish, but when we came upon that fish tank one day while shopping, we knew it had to go in our dorm room. I had my college, my roommate, my fish tank, and my chosen field of study. I also knew who my future husband would be once I graduated from UNC. Bill was still my boyfriend. We'd been dating since I was 16. Not only did he know how to make me laugh, we enjoyed hiking, listening to Bach, and discussing the nature of reality. We also seemed to have a psychic connection to each other. I always knew whenever he had tried to call my home while I was away, shopping or having dinner with my family. And remember, this was the time before answering machines and cell phones. I couldn't imagine myself with anyone else, and to prove it, I had secretly started taking birth control pills so that we could at last do it. To my shock, he refused. "You're the kind of girl who needs to wait until marriage," he said. "What kind of bullshit is that?" I said, feeling hurt and rejected. "I love you, and no matter what, I want you to be my first." "No," he said. He told me that he was convinced that deep down inside I did not want to have sex with him. What in the world was he talking about? Did he feel this way because of that stupid dream I had shared with him? One night, around the time I'd been planning how to get myself on the pill without my parents knowing about it, I'd had a dream that I was in bed, naked with a guy whose face I couldn't see. Though at that time I had never had intercourse, in the dream not only could I feel the weight of this man on top of me and the piece of his body that was inside me, I could also feel the hair on his chest, his tongue in my mouth, his hand upon my left breast. And then, strangely enough, his hand began to tremble upon my breast. In the dream, I remember thinking, how odd. And then I wondered if his hand were trembling because he loved me so much. That, of course, was a completely sappy thing to be thinking. And I told Bill so the next day when I relayed to him the story of this dream. I thought he would find the dream to be funny, but he didn't laugh. "Was I the man in your dream?" he asked. I hesitated, feeling a little awkward. What kind of question was this? It had only been a dream. "Was I the man?" he asked again. "No," I said. "But he wasn't real. It was a dream. Why are you acting this way?" Sometimes Bill could be mopey, but once I was in college, I would get myself back on the pill, and when we saw each other over Christmas break the following school year, I would be able to convince him once and for all that he was the one for me. One of the highlights of my high school experience occurred during the spring of my senior year. That was when I was cast to play the part of Huddle in our senior class production of Fiddler on the Roof, that well-known musical that tells the story of a struggling Jewish family in Tsarist Russia. Mr. Orr, our drama director, said he found my personality suitable for such a character. "I see you," he said, "as a person who, like Huddle, would be highly attracted to a young revolutionary." Since I still considered myself to be a rebel, his words pleased me. However, there was a problem. Although I had been able to belt out a couple of short songs in drama productions using my lower chest voice, whenever it came to the sort of upper register falsetto singing, my voice was simply too weak. "I'm sorry, Mr. Orr," I said, "but my voice isn't strong enough to sing the solos of Huddle. They're too high for me." I couldn't help but remember how, as a young girl, my voice had refused to work whenever I had attempted to audition for a solo in the children's church choir. "That's not a problem," he said. "We'll get Mrs. Ream to work with you." Eleanor Ream was the school's choir director. Only those who were nerdier than the band geeks, such as myself, ever sang in the choir. I seriously doubted Mrs. Ream would be able to get my throat to open, but somehow she managed. The woman's vocal instructions worked like magic. Soon I was able to sing all the parts of Tevia's second eldest daughter, Huddle. One night, Mr. Orr took me aside during a final rehearsal. He said that Huddle's song, "Far from the Home I Love," would be the tear-jerker of the whole production. "Parents will be imagining their own child leaving home for the first time," he said. "Be sure to keep that in mind as you sing." I did. I was honored to be singing such a beautifully poignant song. Not only did the words touch the hearts of the parents in the audience, the last verse in particular touched me as well. "There, where my heart has settled long ago, I must go. I must go. Who could imagine I'd be wandering so far from the home I love?" Each time I sang that verse, a wave of sadness would hit me as I looked to the young man who played my father, Tevye. This young man, who eventually moved to New York City to become a professional actor, was one of the greatest acting stars in the history of my high school. On the nights we appeared in full costume upon the stage, he always transformed himself into a heavy-set, middle-aged Jewish father, sick with grief to be saying goodbye to a daughter who was leaving him in order to follow the young revolutionary who had stolen her heart. Perhaps I was only responding to this young man's extraordinary talent, or perhaps, as I would surmise years later, my reaction was due, at least in part, to another factor. But even I was amazed at how deeply I felt I truly loved my Jewish father. Each and every night I sang to him upon that stage. At home, with my real father, things had turned a little tense. Although I had never asked him for help with my high school homework in the past, the weeks-long rehearsals for Fiddler had caused me to fall behind in my schoolwork. One night, completely flustered by a chemistry question, I had gone to my father for some assistance. Before medical school, he had majored in chemistry, so I assumed that concerning my chemistry questions, he would easily be able to put my befuddled brain back on track. Alas, things did not turn out as either of us had expected. Perhaps it was the lack of sleep on my part, or maybe my father was simply tired from his own hard day at work. Whatever the case, his explanations that night made no sense to me, and he began to grow impatient. In a state of exasperation, he finally blew his stack. "How can you be so stupid?" he said. Shocked and offended, I stomped my way back to my room. Never had I been so insulted. Fuming as I tried to figure out the answers to my questions, my mind continued to replay my father's hurtful comment. How dare he accuse me of being stupid? Day after day, as I struggled to prepare for my upcoming end-of-year chemistry final, my feelings of resentment towards my father grew. What a waste to have a dad with a chemistry degree who wasn't able to help prepare me for my chemistry final. One evening, after yet another late night of studying chemistry on my own, I was in bed, tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep, when I was suddenly struck with inspiration. In an instant, the vision of my entire future changed. Tossing aside my plans to study psychology as a college student, I decided that I would instead major in chemistry, just as my father had. Dismissing the fact that chemistry had bored me to tears that year, I figured that all I needed was a little determination and I would excel at chemistry, just as my father had. And after obtaining a degree in chemistry, I would then go on to medical school and prove to my father that he wasn't so special after all. I would, of course, become a surgeon, just as he had, since surgeons, that is, those not in the military, were the ones who made all the money in medicine. But my medical practice would be far more successful than my father's, which meant that my salary would be more impressive. And if I ever had a daughter who wanted to attend Warren Wilson College, I would gladly agree to pay her private school tuition. Sighing with contentment, palms cradling the back of my head upon my pillow, I lay in my bed happily imagining my new future. Already I could see myself making rounds at the hospital, clumping with authority upon the shiny tiles of a hospital hallway in my low-heeled black pumps, my crisp white doctor's coat on top of a striped blouse, tucked in at the waist of a dark wool-fitted knee-length skirt, silver aluminum clipboard nestled in the crook of my right arm, stethoscope draped round my neck, pins at the ready, and a front pocket of my coat. I always carry at least 3, I found myself thinking, in case one pen runs out of ink and I accidentally lose another. I now saw myself pushing open the door to a hospital room, smiling at a frail, gray-haired woman propped up on pillows behind the railings of her hospital bed. "Good morning," I heard myself say, reaching across the railing to shake her hand, and then an explosion of noise was inside my head, causing me to bolt upright. I hadn't realized I'd fallen asleep. Heart pounding as I scanned the darkness of my bedroom, I found myself wondering, what is this maddening noise? It sounded as if the inner strings of a grand piano were being struck by a heavy wooden mallet that was sweeping back and forth, Zweep, zwoop, zweep, zwoop, zweep, zwoop, went the mallet upon the strings. What kind of a dream was this? Was the noise ever going to end? At that thought, the mallet stopped its striking. I waited, still sitting upright in my bed, listening as the reverberating echo of all those vibrating piano strings slowly faded away. Never before had I encountered such a huge level of noise in a dream. What was going on? For an instant, my old childhood fear of being crazy returned. But then I told myself it was only a dream. Pulling my sheet up to my shoulder, I prepared to lie back down, and that was the moment the voice returned, the inner voice from my childhood. Although it was still without sound, unlike the piano string noise that had awakened me, it now carried so much force that every molecule of my body felt as if it were standing at attention. Was the source of the inner voice angry with me? It certainly felt that way. The only reason, came the soundless but supercharged voice from within, you are here, is to love. In that moment, a door seemed to open inside my mind. Not only did I feel overwhelming joy to have my invisible friend back, I now remembered that I, or some part of me, had actually agreed to this long before I was born. I was here, I now remembered, to learn how to love. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Tears formed in my eyes as I continued to repeat over and over again, thank you, thank you, thank you. I can't believe I forgot. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. My gratitude could not have been any stronger had someone moments before grabbed me from the edge of a cliff in order to prevent my fall to death. I knew I had been saved, not from death, but from regret. The regret I knew I would have felt at the end of my life had I never remembered why I was here. Thank you, I whispered yet again. Thank you. Thank you so, so much. As a child, I had always assumed that the inner soundless voice belonged to God. But now I found myself examining the voice through the lens of a young adult mind, a lens that had been shaped by a year and a half of atheism and also by my senior year study of psychology. My teenaged atheist self was surprised to discover that I felt an immediate and seemingly innate love for the source of this invisible friend. It was as if we had never been apart. As a child, the inner voice had felt much wiser and more adult than my own mind. Now that I was a young adult, the source of the inner voice no longer felt other, even though I could tell it was much, much larger than my own small mind. My human-sized personal mind felt like a drop of water in this vast ocean-sized mind. Was this ocean of consciousness the collective unconscious of which Carl Jung had spoken? If so, then the labels needed to be reversed, I decided, because this larger mind was certainly more conscious than my dinky human mind. How, I wondered, could I have forgotten that I was here to learn how to love? Such a simple thing to have remembered, and yet, without the source of the inner voice, I never would have remembered. The larger mind, I was sure, had tried to jostle my memory with that long ago soundless inner message of yes in response to my old Sunday school teacher's lesson about love. But that reminder had eventually faded away. As I pondered the possible workings of what I believed to be this larger mind, I became aware of a faint twitter of birdsong beyond my window. Glancing outside, I was surprised to see that the black sky had lightened to a shade of pale gray. Forgetting all about my publicly professed atheism, I got out of bed and kneeled upon the carpet of my bedroom floor. It wasn't that I believed any special form of prayer was necessary. Surely this larger mind, which contained my small human mind within it, already knew my every thought. I simply wanted to demonstrate the seriousness of my intent. Placing my hands palm to palm, I quietly spoke to what I envisioned as the large sea of consciousness where my own personal mind resided. Never ever again did I want to forget why I was here. And since I knew that my own small mind could not be trusted to remember, I decided to surrender my personal human mind to the larger body of consciousness, which was, I believed, my larger, greater whole. I am yours, I said. Teach me how to love. Lead me where I need to be. Help me to become who I am here to be. Thank you. There was no response from within, but there was no doubt in my mind that this larger sea of consciousness would, from this day forward, be my teacher. I never once that morning thought to call this larger mind God. I think it's because the concept of God I had been taught growing up in the Methodist Church did not fit this new picture I had now of a large sea of consciousness containing all smaller forms of consciousness, including my own little mind. Like a fluffy seed pod newly released upon the invisible currents of air, I had just launched myself upon a great and wonderful adventure. The dawn of that day marked the very moment when I surrendered myself to the larger mind, believing with all my heart that it would teach me how to love.